it's Economics here. This is a feedback video for my Year 11 students who have just completed the first assessment of the new year. Great to get cracking on this again. And this week we looked at A591 June 2010 paper, which is of course the microeconomics paper, and we were looking at question 2. So next week when I give you your papers back, I'm not going to spend time in the lesson doing our dip time. This is going to be part of your homework, and I'm going to run through these 8 points and these 2 diagrams, and I will explain to you next week what I want you to do having watched this video. There is a lot of work to be done, ladies and gentlemen, to bring our work up to target for most of you. So let's work through each question. So the first question, you were presented with a chart and it shows the price of petrol. Now the first thing I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is look very carefully at the units on the axes of this particular chart, because it says pence per litre, and somebody who shall remain nameless referred to petrol being £90 per litre. £90 per litre. No, it's 90 pence. So you need to avoid those very elementary mistakes such as that. And the other thing that you need to do is that you need to look carefully at the number of marks allocated to each question. So this particular question, a very simple question, or it should have been, for 2 marks, and you then simply have to identify 2 separate points. Now the 2 points in this instance where you had to explain that price had increased over the time period shown, and also you then needed to quantify that by saying it has increased from such and such a price to such and such a price, and maybe calculated the difference. Very straightforward. Nobody should have been getting anything less than 2 marks, full marks on that one. Okay, next question. 2B part 1. And you're asked to show what would happen to the price of petrol if there is an increase in the price of oil. Now oil, of course, is a raw material, therefore it is an input cost for petrol producers. And as you know, costs of production are represented on the supply curve. So you should have been shifting the supply curve upwards and to the left, and consequently price would go up, quantity demanded and supplied would fall. Again, some people shifting demand. It's not, it's supply. Point 2 was simply to sort of read those off the chart. B part 3. Assume there's a fall in the price of petrol. Explain how the price elasticity of demand might affect the revenue of petrol companies. Okay, so this question was asking you and really wanted you to consider the fact that petrol is inelastic in demand. Okay, so if we take a very high price here, P1, and we've got Q1, and we then drop the price, okay, drop the price, you can drop that price quite significantly, like so, to P2, quantity goes to Q2. Now, because of this very price inelastic nature of demand, we have a large change in price and a very small change in quantity. So that means that even though you drop the price a lot, not many more people buy petrol. So actually, dropping the price of petrol is for petrol retailers shooting themselves in the foot, because they will not earn more revenue as a consequence of the fact that quantity demanded hardly goes up at all. So that was the answer to that one. And the other thing was that if you're asked to refer to price elasticity of demand in your answer, then make sure that you actually refer to it. So a lot of you sort of, I think it's maybe because you weren't actually too sure of the answer, you then sort of skirted around the answer without actually mentioning PED. So perhaps you'll need to refresh your memories with regard to PED. Next question. Part C. Explain one likely effect of a large increase in the price of new cars on the demand for petrol. Now, one aspect of this question which not many people got was the fact that if the price of new cars goes up, and so people stop buying new cars, does that necessarily mean that everyone else who has a car suddenly get rid of their cars. Does that mean that if the price of new cars go up and nobody's buying a new car, does that change the number of cars on the roads? Not necessarily. And so actually maybe revenue won't change at all. Now, one or two of the real good answers on that one did get that particular point. Okay, and then lastly we move to this discussion question about whether or not taxes would be better than subsidies on, so it's a tax on petrol, would it be better than subsidising public transport in terms of getting people to reduce their use of cars? Now, I'm going to refer to these two diagrams. I'll just make sure the camera is well zoomed in on that. Okay, ladies and gents, so here we have our tax diagram and here we have our subsidy diagram. Note, ladies and gentlemen, in neither instance is there a shift in demand. Demand stays at D1 in this instance and D1 in this instance. It is the supply that's changing. Why? Because a tax impacts on the cost of production and a subsidy impacts on the cost of production. Costs of production are illustrated via the supply curve. So let's consider the tax diagram first of all. Remember, it's a tax on petrol. So the first thing you need to think about is the shape of your demand curve with regard to petrol being a price inelastic good. So it's very steep. So as a consequence, the supply curve shifts from S1 to S plus tax. Price goes up. You can see I'm indicating the direction of travel by use of arrows. Price goes up, P1 to P2, and quantity demanded and supplied goes from Q1 to Q2. Now this whole notion of quantity demanded and supply changing is very important. Supply changes because the supply shifts S1 to S plus tax. Demand changes in this instance because, as you know, we are moving along the demand curve. That's very early microeconomics. We move up and along the demand curve. And so as a consequence, we have a reduction in both demand and supply. But you've got to get the terminology right, whether or not it's a shift or a movement along. Having established that, you then need, and certainly the better answers here, indicated the area of tax revenue. Now we take that from the final sort of resting place here, which is P2, Q2. And it's the vertical distance between the two curves, the two supply curves. So it's from there down to there. So that gives us another price point, P3. And so the total area of tax revenue, ladies and gentlemen, would be P2, A, B, P3. So that whole rectangle would be your total area of tax revenue. However, the very best answers then went on to explain that most of that tax revenue would be paid by the consumer, that area there, which is above P1, and the area below, this smaller area, is paid by the producer. So that is why, ladies and gentlemen, a tax on an inelastic good is effective because it hits the consumer in their pocket. However, you can see in this instance that even though it's a very significant tax, quantity demanded has fallen by a relatively small amount. And that, of course, comes back to the nature of petrol. We need petrol to get around, and so even if price goes up, people will say, oh well, we'll have to maybe reduce our spend on our shopping because we really need our car to get from A to B, to get to work, to get the kids to school and so on. And so as a consequence, we don't really see much of a reduction in the quantity demanded. Let's now turn to subsidy. Costs of production fall in the case of a subsidy. So price falls from P1 to P2, quantity demanded and supplied again. So supply goes up because we shift supply, demand goes up because we movement along the demand curve. Okay, subsidy. Who's paying the subsidy? The government's handing out this subsidy. Obviously they raise it through taxes, but they're handing out this subsidy. How much does this cost the government? Well, again, we take it from Q2. So to get the cost to the government of this subsidy, in the same way as we find the revenue here at Q2, we go to Q2 here, and we go up to S1, and then across, and again we get our new point P3. And so if we were explaining to the examiner the total cost to the government of this subsidy, because they're subsidising from 0 to Q2 units, the total cost of this subsidy is P3, A, B, P2. So it's that very large rectangle, so very costly. You can see I've drawn this demand curve fairly flat. Now that, as you know, is price elastic. Why have I drawn it like that? Well, because public transport and consumers of public transport, they are and can be sensitive, certainly more sensitive than in terms of petrol prices, to changes in price. So therefore, relatively smaller changes in the price of bus, rail, etc., that would induce an increase in quantity demanded of a greater extent than this reduction in quantity demanded. So price falls P1 to P2, quantity demanded and quantity supplied rise to Q1 and to Q2. And so you might therefore say, on this basis, it would be more effective to subsidise public transport, because then people are more likely to use the cheaper public transport. Now, of course, you then need to evaluate as to whether or not that's the case. So you might say things like, well, if you live in the countryside, people in the countryside, they still need to get from A to B, and you can't always do that via bus or train. And so a subsidy to public transport for people living in those areas where your car is basically essential, then that might not be effective. It also depends, in both instances, on the size of the tax or the size of the subsidy. Substitutability, what do we mean there? Well, I mean, how easy is it for some people to switch from car to public transport? For some people it's easy because they live near a metro station or they live near a bus route. But for many, many people, that's not the case. Some people mention the unreliability of public transport. Again, worth mentioning. And then as a final, we've already talked about PED, as a final point you might say people nowadays are much more concerned about how much they are damaging the environment. Now, if they are of a mind to take care of the environment, then they may be more easily persuaded to reduce their consumption of petrol, not travel by car, and hence use public transport instead. And that, ladies and gentlemen, just about wraps it up. One final thing to say, I noticed that I've got there's something called hypothecated taxes. I'll write that word out here again, hypothecated. Now, hypothecation of taxes means that if you raise tax, it's ring fencing taxation. So if you raise taxes, for example, by taxing users of cars, then you use that tax revenue and put that money into other transport infrastructure. So you may build new roads, or perhaps alternatively you would improve the rail network or the metro network or whatever it may be. But it's this whole notion of ring fencing the taxes so that the taxes raised from transport issues can then be spent solving those transport issues. Now I follow somebody on YouTube called the Missenden Flyer, and most of his vlogs and vlogs, ladies and gentlemen, are to do with motorcycles. However, just last week, the Missenden Flyer put one out on taxes, particularly road tax, and how road taxes are used. And I'll put a little link down below, and it might be worth you having a little look at that particular video by TMF, the Missenden Flyer. So shout out to TMF. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. This will form part of your homework and your improvement work for next week.